Okay, this is actually about being a historian.
Yeah. If that's okay. So I was just wondering if it's difficult to move forward in historical debates about this time period because of limited resources, and since it was in the past, how can you really like prove certain speculations, and like maybe also how like where do you get information personally to prove like certain points that you may have?
What a great question. I think ultimately the historian has to use judgment. But as your question suggests, we have to make a decision about how much hindsight we can use to exercise those judgments. We must never lose sight of the fact that time, even for those as blind to the realities as Nicholas II, it was very difficult to make judgments about what's happening because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You have different pressures pulling you one way or the other. And as historians, it's all too easy to look back and say, oh, well, Nicholas II got it all wrong. He was a fool not to see the realities confronting him. Even in 1905, he failed to see that he was about to lose his throne and had to be reminded of it by Witte before he introduced his October reforms. But, you know, at the time, Nicholas II, perhaps not the most brilliant politician or even the brightest man, had all sorts of pressures on him, had all sorts of things to weigh up in a way that as historians later we perhaps lose sight of. So we have to have a balance between exercising hindsight to come to our judgments and giving the benefit of the doubt perhaps, or allowing for human fallibility in the circumstances at the time. So that's a very difficult balance to strike because we don't always have the evidence about actually what Witte or Stolypin or Nicholas II thought were the factors to be considered. And so we have to resort to, well, he must have known this, or he is likely to have known that, in which case his judgment was so good or so bad. But then there's the other thing, which is in exercising judgments, and we've been doing so throughout this seminar, we play that what-if game. We play the game, well, if Stolypin had been given 20 more years, would revolution have been avoided? Well, that's a very big, because a lot happens in 20 years, and the First World War is a very big event, which was going to happen anyway. Even isolating one small chain of causation is a very hazardous thing to do. And so is that a reasonable thing for historians to do? I think it probably is, but we have to be very careful about exercising or asking those what-if questions in a historically realistic way. So, for example, for this period, you might reasonably ask the question, which you have done, what would have happened to Stolypin's reforms if he hadn't been assassinated? That's a realistic question because, you know, Bagrat could easily have been arrested or apprehended in some way, Stolypin not shot. He would have carried on in government, but we know that there were political forces against him on the right and on the left. We know that probably he would have been removed from power, or his reformist initiatives would have been curtailed. And that then sets up realistic alternatives to Stolypin being removed and the reform agenda run down altogether. So, you know, that's a very careful balance that one has to make. And in the end, I don't think we can avoid asking the what-if questions and the evaluations that come with them if we want to explain big events that we know are coming. So all the questions we ask about the period between 1905 and 1914 are obviously asked with the knowledge that 1917 is coming. So we want to know, well, what might have averted the revolutionary crisis? What might have satisfied the liberals and the radicals and perhaps some elements of the workers and the peasants and the nationalities in a way to weaken the revolutionary movement? And that's a realistic question, because ultimately the proof of its realism is in the fact that at the time even Lenin knew it to be a realistic question. So Lenin knew, for example, that Stolypin's land reforms were likely in the long run, if they succeeded, to undermine the revolutionary movement. And he said, if Stolypin succeeds, the revolution will not happen. So that's, if you like, a sort of test of what is a realistic what-if question to ask. But ultimately, that's always the historian's judgment, how much hindsight to use and where to strike that balance between hindsight and imagining events and decisions from the perspective of the time.